Hello everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Bayer, and I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. When we examine our list of priorities in life, at the very top there might be something like happiness or purpose. From there it might go to things which are subsets or bridges to those two, such as finding love or doing something meaningful with the time given us. From there it might go to more practical things like finances or health. As we continue on this imaginary list, we may venture into more everyday things that are nevertheless important, such as various activities or just having a good time. After that, it's really anybody's guess, since this is, after all, a very personal and very haphazard survey. It's a good bet that religion is pretty far down on most people's list these days. It just doesn't hold the vitality that it once held. Its rituals and beliefs no longer ring all that important in most people's eyes, and they really have a hard time being bothered with something they no longer consider relevant. It's a little sad that this is the way things are, and probably will continue to go. It was not all that long ago that religious matters were the end-all and be-all of life. They were the pivot around which the world revolved. Perhaps some people secretly long for those days, when everything could be settled with just a question to an authoritative source or a simple matter of turning on belief. There was something very assuring about that type of life, but it doesn't look like it's coming back anytime soon. Along with the decline of religion in general, there was a parallel and complementary decline in the entire notion of the sacred. That vast category of things, ranging from holy days to holy people to holy objects, with everything in between thrown in for good measure, has gone the way of the typewriter. Hardly anybody values something as sacred anymore. It's a status that more likely brings ridicule than respect. To say something is sacred today is almost as bad as believing in a flat earth. It's just no longer a measure of value, and most people would rather the entire notion be put to rest. Nevertheless, it is still around, perhaps in some museum or old building. Sacred things are easy to be found, even if we no longer consider them to be sacred. It's not the least bit hard to find them if one is willing to look in the right places. The hard part is believing that these things are indeed sacred. That takes a great deal of effort, and may be out of reach for many people today. This is a great loss, in a sense, since believing in the sacred once added a great deal of mystery and sanctity to life. That is something that cannot be replaced, no matter how hard we try. The loss of mystery and sanctity is profound. It leaves us with nothing to hold precious. This week's Parsha is called Emor. That small word means say, an innocuous opening to a Parsha that doesn't even give us a clue about the subjects within. It turns out to be nothing more than the first word of a command from God to Moshe to give a whole list of instructions to the Kohanim, the priests of the line of Aaron. They were a special class in biblical society, charged with keeping the sanctuary functioning along the standards of holiness that were required and instructing the people as to what they should do to maintain that sanctity of the nation. Included in this list of instructions were unique laws of whom they could marry, what kind of physical blemishes disqualified them from their tasks, and the higher level of physical and spiritual purity they were required to maintain. There are laws relating to the daughters of priests and when they lose their status if they marry into a non-priestly family. Finally, there are all kinds of rules about the physical conditions of the animals which could be brought as an offering in the sanctuary. Just like with the priests themselves, the animals had to be free of specific blemishes on their bodies to be considered acceptable. This all comes from under the general rubric of holiness. It is summed up with a statement about always sanctifying God and never desecrating God's holy name. This is followed by a complete list of all the holy days on the biblical calendar. They are all there. Shabbat, Passover, Shavuot, the first day of the 7th month, which has come to be identified as Rosh Hashanah, New Year's Day, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. This list differs from the shorter list of the pilgrimage holidays, which only contain Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. It also includes the period between Passover and Shavuot, known as the time of the counting of the Omer, which we happen to be in right now, and during which this Parsha is always read. When all this is finished, there are some details about the bread that was brought to the sanctuary and left there for a period of about a week. It is called Holy of Holies among the various offerings and had to be eaten only in a particular holy spot of the sanctuary. When this little addition is stated, the Parsha then veers into something totally unexpected. It only takes up several verses at the end of the Parsha, so it is easy to forget that it is there. But there it is, strange and uncalled for. It is the brief story of a man of part Israelite and part Egyptian lineage, who, for some reason that is left unclear, got into an argument with somebody and then blasphemed God's name. The only detail we are given about him is his mother's name and the tribe she came from. They put the man in some sort of custody, since it wasn't clear what should be done with him. It seems that the sin of blasphemy had never been spelled out earlier in the Torah, but it was understood that this was something that couldn't go unpunished. Moshe received the instructions from God that the blasphemer was to be taken out of the camp, and all who heard him blaspheme should place their hands on his head. The entire community should then stone him to death. As drastic as this sounds, it was then made into a general commandment for the future. Quote, anyone who curses God shall bear his sin. The one who blasphemes with the actual name of God shall be stoned to death by the entire congregation. Whether a convert or a native born, he shall be put to death. After a few other peripherally related laws about harming others and harming animals, the Parsha concludes with the actual stoning of this man. It is told very matter of fact in just one verse. And then the Parsha is over and the next Parsha begins, which has nothing to do with any of this. It is all very bizarre and a little anticlimactic. We are left with no means of processing this terrible sin and its horrible consequences. It sounds very biblical, but to the modern ear it brings up impressions of ISIS or the Taliban, or perhaps Monty Python. What are we to make of all this? It comes as such a shock that such a thing should be in this Parsha, coming out of nowhere as it does, that we simply read it and that's that. But when we actually contemplate what we have read, we are probably stricken with a bit of horror. They actually stoned a person to death for saying a few words. There is no justification for this that could be made to the modern person who expects these sort of things to be relegated to ancient cults and merciless warlords. This is a really tough one to answer. In fact, there probably is no answer that will satisfy people today. This is just the way things were back then. Judaism has long since moved on from this. Nobody is advocating stoning blasphemers to death. That probably hasn't been seen or heard of for over 2,000 years in Judaism. In fact, it is not really known if it was ever done in Jewish or Israelite circles apart from this one case in the Torah. This is a relic of the distant past, when such matters had to be dealt with swiftly and with vengeance. We are no longer there. That being said, we still have to answer for why it was there back then. Granted that the harsh punishment of stoning was very much in vogue, why exactly was it dealt out to the blasphemer? Granted, this question could have been asked on any of the other sins for which the penalty was stoning. Nevertheless, it has to be explained here. Why couldn't they just tell this guy he did something wrong, give him a slap on the wrist, and let matters go? That seems to have been the way of dealing with someone who merely, quote, cursed God, without using the actual name of God. He, quote, bears his sin with seemingly no other penalty. What was so terrible about adding the unique name of God into the mix? This takes us into the ancient and mostly forgotten and abandoned world of the sacred. This name, this single four-letter Hebrew word, was sacred beyond description. That status was not something arbitrary that could be removed with a flick of the wrist. It was a permanent status that was unique among all other words or sounds. While that may not ring rational to modern ears, to ancient Israelite ears, it was nothing short of essential. The word consists of 4 letters, 2 of them the same. It seems to mean something on the order of existence or being or reality. That combination of letters, the pronunciation of which has largely been lost for Judaism for centuries, was the way to address and approach God. It was God's unique name and the holiest word in the Bible. Surprisingly, it is also one of the most common words in the Bible, but that only cements the Bible as the holiest of books. The sacred is something that we have largely lost touch with. It was there in the world and in people's lives, and then it wasn't. That doesn't necessarily make us more enlightened than ancient people who believed this kind of stuff. On the contrary, they had something that we no longer have access to. They could appreciate and fear the sacred, It was a dimension of spirituality that made life and reality a good deal more mysterious than it is now. Are we better off with all that to confuse and frighten our lives with all kinds of notions of fear and holy and sanctity? Or are we lesser beings, too numb to the mysteries of the world to appreciate that there might be something that we cannot put in a box and label, or measure and take a picture of to send off on Instagram? This is something that only we can answer as individuals. It won't do to go along with the flow on this one. To appreciate the sacred, to sanctify something as holy as the unique name of God, is to live in a dimension in which certain things are vital and essential and dwarf all others. There may be sanctity in everything, and all things may contain the spark of God, but some things still have to be treated with the awe that they deserve. The name of God is one such thing. To know it is to be in awe of it. It cannot be any other way. Shabbat Shalom.